When Robert Ammon, a member of the New York Bar, was convicted after a long trial on the 17th of June 1903 of receiving stolen goods, he had been due for a long time. The stolen property in question was the sum of $30,500, part of the loot of the notorious Franklin Syndicate, devised and engineered by William Miller, the subject of this history. For years, Bob Ammon had been a familiar figure in the Wall Street district of New York. Although the legal advisor of swindlers and confidence men, he was a type of American whose energies, if turned in a less dubious direction, might well have brought him honorable distinction. Unfortunately, his experiences with the law had bred in him a contempt for it which ultimately caused his downfall. He could talk a police inspector or a city magistrate into a state of vacuous credulity, and needless to say, he was to his clients as a god knowing both good and evil, as well as how to eschew the one and avoid the other. Miller hated, loathed and feared him, yet freely entrusted his liberty to this strange and powerful personality, which held him enthralled by the mere exercise of a physical superiority. The Franklin Syndicate had collapsed amid the astonished outcries of its thousands of victims on November 24, 1899, when, under the advice and with the assistance of Ammon, its organizer, 520% Miller, had fled to Canada. It was nearly 4 years later, in June 1903, that Ammon heard the district attorney call William Miller, now a convicted felon, to the stand to testify against him. The trial of Ammon involved practically the reproving of the case against Miller, for which the latter had been convicted and sentenced to 10 years in state prison, whence he now issued like one from the tomb to point the skeleton, incriminating finger at his betrayer. But the case began by the convict witness testifying that the whole business was a miserable fraud from start to finish, carried on and guided by the advice of the defendant. He told how he, burdened with a sick wife and baby, a hanger-on of bucket shops and a speculator in tiny lots of feeble stocks, finding himself without means of support, conceived the alluring idea of soliciting funds for investment, promising enormous interest, and paying this interest out of the principal entrusted to him. For a time he preyed only upon his friends, claiming inside information of large deals and paying 10% per week on the money received out of his latest deposits. Miller prospered. His earlier friend customers, who had hesitatingly taken his receipt for $10 and thereafter had received $1 every Monday morning, repeated the operation and returned in ever-increasing numbers. From having his office in his hat, he took an upper room in a small 2-story tenement, destined to be the scene of one of the most extraordinary exhibitions of man's cupidity and foolishness in modern times. This was in February 1899. Business increased. The monetary flood began to appear in an attenuated but constant rivulet. He hired 4 more employees and the whole top floor of a house on Floyd Street in Brooklyn. The rivulet became a steady stream. He rolled in ready thousands. He began to call himself the Franklin Syndicate and to advertise that the way to wealth is as plain as the road to the market. There was an instantaneous response. The stream of money became a rushing torrent. Every Monday morning the house was crowded with depositors who drew their interest, added to it, deposited it again, and went upon their way rejoicing. Then with a mighty roar the torrent burst into a deluge. The Floyd Street quarters were besieged by a clamoring multitude fighting to see which of them could give up his money first, and there had to be a special delivery for Miller's mail. Fridays the public stormed the house, since the money must be deposited on that day to draw interest for the following week. The crush was so enormous that the stoop broke down. There Miller sat behind a desk at the top of the stoop, solemnly taking the money thrown down before him and handing out little pink and green stamped receipts in exchange. There was no place to put the money, so it was shoved onto the floor behind him. Friday afternoons, Miller and his clerks waded through it, knee-high. There was no pretense of bookkeeping. Simply in self-defense, Miller issued in October a statement that he could not, in justice to his business, consent to receive less than $50 at one time. Theoretically, there was no reason why the thing should not have gone on practically forever, Miller and everybody else becoming richer and richer. So long as the stream swelled 5 times each year, everybody would be happy. How could anybody fail to be happy who saw so much money lying around loose everywhere? But the business had increased to such an extent that Miller began to distrust his own capacity to handle it. He therefore secured a partner in the person of one Edward Schlesinger, and with him went to Charlestown, Massachusetts for the purpose of opening another office, in charge of which they placed a man named Louis Powers. History repeated itself. Powers shipped the deposits to Miller every day or two by express. Was there ever such a plethora of easy money? But Schlesinger was no Miller. He decided that he must have a third of the profits and have them, moreover, each day in cash. Hence there was a daily accounting, part of the receipts being laid aside to pay off interest checks and interest, and the balance divided. Schlesinger carried his off in a bag. Miller took the rest, cash, money orders and checks, and deposited it in a real bank. How the money poured in may be realized from the fact that the excess of receipts over disbursements for the month ending November 16th was $430,000. Hitherto, Miller had been the central figure. Colonel Robert Ammon now became the deus ex machina. Miller's advertising had become so extensive that he had been forced to retain a professional agent, one Rudolf Gunther, to supervise it, and when the newspapers began to make unpleasant comments, Gunther took Miller to Ammon's office in the Bennett Building in Nassau Street. Ammon accepted $100 from Miller, listened to his account of the business, and examined copies of the circulars. When he was handed one of the printed receipts, he said they were incriminating. Miller must try to get them back. He advised incorporating the business, since by this means stock could be sold and exchanged for the incriminating receipts. From now on, Miller and he were in frequent consultation, and Ammon took steps to incorporate, procuring for that purpose from Wells Fargo a certificate of deposit for $100,000. Miller became a mere puppet. Ammon twitched the wire. In spite of Ammon's confidence, however, there was an uneasy feeling in the air, and it was decided to put an advertisement in the post offering to allow any customer who so desired to withdraw his deposit without notice upon the following Saturday. This announcement did not have precisely the anticipated effect, and Saturday saw a large crowd of victims eager to withdraw their money from the Boston office of the Franklin Syndicate. Powers paid the Pauls of Boston out of the bag brought on by Miller containing the deposits of the Peters of Brooklyn. Some timid souls took courage and redeposited their money. The run continued one day and cost Ammon and Miller about $28,000. Ammon took $5,000 cash as a fee out of the bag, and the pair returned to New York. But confidence had been temporarily restored. The beginning of the end, however, was now in sight for the keen vision of Bob Ammon. He advised stimulating deposits and laying hands on all the money possible before the crash came. Customers in large measure responded, but the game was nearly up. There were scareheads in the papers. Miller saw detectives on every corner and, like a rat leaving a sinking ship, Schlesinger scuttled away for the last time with a bag of money on the evening of Tuesday, November 21st, 1899. The rest of the deposits were crammed into Miller's desk and left there overnight. The next morning, Miller returned to Floyd Street and spent that day in the usual routine, and also on Thursday remained until about 12 o'clock noon, when he placed $30,500 in bills in a satchel and started for Ammon's office, where he found Schlesinger, likewise with a satchel. Ammon said the best thing Miller could do was flee to Canada. It still remained to secure the money, which Miller had deposited in the banks, in such a way that the customers could not get hold of it. Ammon explained how that could easily be done. The money should be all turned over to him, and none of the creditors would ever see it again. He did not deem it necessary to suggest that neither would Miller. Accordingly, the two, the lawyer and the client, went to the office of Wells Fargo, Ammon obligingly carrying the satchel containing the $30,500. Here, Ammon deposited the contents to his own account, as well as the certificate of deposit for $100,000 previously mentioned, and a check for $10,000, representing the balance of Miller's loot. The character of the gentleman is well illustrated by the fact that later, when paying Mrs. Miller her miserable pittance of $5 per week, he explained to her that he was giving her that out of his own money, and that her husband owed him. Miller returned to Floyd Street the next morning at about 9:30, finding a great crowd of people waiting outside. About 1 o'clock he started to go home, but discovering that he was being followed by a man whom he took to be a detective, he boarded a streetcar, dodged through a drugstore and a Chinese laundry, finally made the elevated railroad with his pursuer at his heels, and eventually reached the lawyer's office about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Word was received almost immediately over the telephone that Miller had been indicted in Kings County for conspiracy to defraud, and Ammon stated that the one thing for Miller to do was to go away. Miller replied that he did not want to go unless he could take his wife and baby with him, but Ammon assured him that he would send them to Canada, later in charge of his own wife. Under this promise, Miller agreed to go, and Ammon procured a man named Enright to take Miller to Canada, saying that he was an ex-detective and could get him out of the way. Ammon must have laughed like a vaudeville villain as poor Miller trotted down the stairs like a sheep leaving his fleece behind him. Here was a little fellow who had invented a brilliant scheme to get away with other people's money and had carried it through successfully, and then, richer than Midas, had handed over the whole jolly fortune to another for the other's asking, without even taking a scrap of paper to show for it. The money was stolen, to be sure, but Ammon's skirts were clear. There was nothing to show that the $245,000 he had received was stolen money. There was only one man, a discredited felon, who could hint that the money was even tainted, and he was safely over the border in a foreign jurisdiction, not in the custody of the police, but of Ammon himself, to be kept there waiting on orders. 2 weeks later, though, Miller was safely ensconced without bail in Raymond Street Jail. Schlesinger, who got away with $175,000 in cash, fled to Europe, where he lived high, frequenting the race tracks and gaming tables until he was called to his final account. Miller was tried, convicted, and sent to Sing Sing. Of the enormous sums turned over to Ammon, Miller received nothing save the money necessary for his support in Montreal, for the lawyers who defended him, and $5 per week for his wife and child, up to the time he turned state's evidence. The conviction of Miller, with his sentence to 10 years in state's prison, did not, however, prevent the indictment of Ammon for receiving stolen money in New York County, although the chance that he would ever have to suffer for his crime seemed small indeed. Up to the time of Ammon's trial, Miller had never admitted his guilt, that he was still absolutely and apparently irrevocably under Ammon's influence, keeping in constant communication with him and implicitly obeying his instructions while in prison, and that Miller's wife and child were dependent upon Ammon for their daily bread. The district attorney of New York County was at his wit's end to devise a means to procure the evidence to convict him. It was easy enough to prove that Miller stole hundreds of thousands of dollars, that Ammon received hundreds of thousands, but he had to prove that the same money stolen by Miller passed to the hands of Ammon. Only one man in the world, as Ammon had foreseen, could supply this last necessary link in the chain of evidence, and he was a convict and mute. But eventually, Miller sent word that he had determined to tell the truth and take the stand, whatever the consequences to himself and his family might be. He was immediately transferred to the Tombs prison in New York City, where he made a complete and full confession, not only assisting in every way in securing evidence for the prosecution of Ammon, but aiding his trustee in bankruptcy to determine the whereabouts of some $60,000 of the stolen money, which but for him would never have been recovered. At the same time, Ammon was rearrested upon a bench warrant, and his bail sufficiently increased to render his appearance for trial probable. As Miller had foreseen, the monthly payment to his wife instantly stopped. The usual effect produced upon a jury by the testimony of a convict accomplice is one of distrust or open incredulity. Every word of Miller's story, however, carried with it the impression of absolute truth. As he proceeded, an extraordinary wave of sympathy for the man swept over the courtroom, and the jury listened with close attention to his graphic account of the rise and fall of the outrageous conspiracy which had attempted to shield its alluring offer of instant wealth. Supported as Miller was by the corroborative testimony of other witnesses and by the certificates of deposit which Ammon had, with his customary bravado, made out in his own handwriting, no room was left for even the slightest doubt, not only that the money had been stolen, but that Ammon had received it. Ammon's conviction was affirmed throughout the courts, and Ammon began serving his sentence. Miller's original purpose had been to secure money to speculate with, for he had been bitten deep by the bug of Wall Street, and his early experiences had led him to believe that he could beat the market if only he had sufficient margin. This margin he set out to secure. Then, when he saw how easy it was to get money for the asking, he dropped the idea of speculation and simply became a banker. He did make one bona fide attempt, but the stock went down, he sold out and netted a small loss. Had Miller actually continued to speculate, it is doubtful whether he could have been convicted for any crime, since it was for that purpose that the money was entrusted to him. He might have lost it all in the street and paid no penalty. As it was, in failing to gamble with it, he became guilty of embezzlement,